Yes, greetings everyone. The purpose for today is to look at the US Africa Summit once again, which happened a few weeks ago. And what we want to examine today is what were our expectations from this US Africa Summit. What are the victories? What were the wins? And at the same time, we will look at what were the failures of the US Africa Summit, and are there lessons for us to learn as Africans? Are there really lessons that should be taken from this summit as Africans? So, without delay, let's get to it. You all know that the United States invited the African heads of state to Washington in its purpose, in its strategy of reintroducing itself, re-engaging the African continent in what it claims, what the United States claims it is a partnership, building new partnership based on mutual respect. I think it is trying to borrow from what the Chinese have been doing in Africa, because the Chinese in the past came through as partners. They have been coming through only as development partners, and not partners who have come to lecture Africa on how it should conduct its political affairs or interfere into the affairs of African states, and how they should conduct their political and social affairs. So, on the other hand, the United States, for the last 60 years also, when it became a superpower since 1945, has been coming through to Africa in the same way the Europeans have been coming through to come to do social engineering in our societies, to make us think like white people, to make us think like Europeans, for us to do away with our political systems and adopt the Western way of systems, and even our societies, how they are engaged. If you talk about things like homosexuality and what they call human rights, we should not understand human rights from our point of view, but we should rather understand it from the point of Europeans and whites. So this they have met a lot of resistance, not only from the African continent but also from the Chinese, because the Chinese have come to the African continent with a different strategy, and this strategy which the Chinese came with has made a lot of it has been welcomed in one sense, and the United States has been facing a lot of resistance on the African continent. So they have decided to re-engage the African continent in this sense. So that was one of the purposes of the US Africa Summit. But we want to look at expectations as Africans. What were our expectations? And those expectations, if we talk about them seriously, were they met? Were those expectations really met? Number one of the things which I expected the African heads of state to do is to go there as one people. We were supposed to speak with one voice, stand together and speak with one voice as Africans. But were the African heads of state able to achieve this? And to that, we will see when we look at the failures and wins, the victories that we were able to achieve. So number one, I expected the African heads of state to stand together and speak together with one voice when they go to the United States on this US Africa Summit. And on that, we were supposed to present our demands, our expectations from this summit. And even though the African Union presented the 6 points which we expected from the United States, such as the removal of sanctions on Zimbabwe, the removal of pressure from the African continent, when we go to the issue of energy, because they are telling us we should transition towards clean energy, but when we have not yet industrialized and they have been industrializing using fossil fuels. One of the other issues was that Africa wants to do business with everyone, and so we should be left to choose our partners on the African continent, whether that is the Russians, whether it is the Chinese, whether it is the Turkish. So the United States should not drag us. So these are some of the points which the African Union presented, through the chairperson of the African Union, who is President Moussa. No, who is President Macky Sall of Senegal currently, not Moussa Faki. Moussa Faki is the chairperson of African Union Commission. So we expected the African Union to stand together in pushing back. So we also expected the African Union to push the narrative of African solutions to African problems. And this is based on the idea that we have been able to solve some of the problems, like when you look at the issue in Ethiopia, the conflict in Ethiopia, that the African Union was able to stand and solve these problems by itself without the United States. There was very little, a contribution of the United States. Actually, if anything, the United States was resisted during this process of finding a solution to the Ethiopian crisis. And so we expected the African Union to push this further, into the other areas, as the narrative has been, about silencing the guns. So the African Union, we think that it did a very good job when it comes to Ethiopia, and it should extend that strategy all the way to places like, Congo, Democratic Republic of Congo, and where it is definitely, engaged, and then the other parts of the Sahel, Somalia, all these areas, the African Union should be able to extend this strategy. So we expected the African heads of state, in addition to point number one, to stand together to push for African solutions to African problems. And this means that, we have to blatantly let the United States know that they have to stand back and leave Africa to operate. They have to let the African Union operate. They have to let the regional bodies like the East African Community to operate on the continent without interference, without the European interference, just like how the Russians have done, just like how the Chinese have done. They have not interfered in how Africa is conducting its affairs. So we expected that to be done. And we also expected the African Union and the African heads of state to stand together with the African diaspora, so that the African diaspora, can also, feel some relief, as we have seen in the past. In the United States, in the streets, people like George Floyd have been gunned down, Sandra Bland, and a lot of other African diaspora have been, gunned down and killed. So we expected the African heads of state to stand together with the African diaspora and say, these people belong to the 6th region of the African Union. And you, as the United States, who's preaching across the globe about human rights and freedom, you need to pay close attention to this. If you need to reform your institutions, you need to go ahead and reform your institutions. But we would not, going forward as Africans, continue to accommodate this attack on people of African descent or the African diaspora of the 6th region, because all these people belong to the 6th region. All people of African descent belong to the African nation, just like how Dr. Kwame Nkrumah would say in the past when he was still here. So these are some of the things personally which I think that we as Africans and African heads of state, they were supposed to push as hard as possible for us to achieve, during this US Africa Summit. Now, what were the wins, with the expectations being put across? What were the wins from this summit? I believe that one of the wins that came out of this summit, we remember that Joe Biden was able to mention that he is behind Africa's getting a seat at the United Nations General Assembly, the United Nations Security Council, a permanent seat, because we remember that in the past, the United States and colonial countries and countries like Russia and China, they are the ones who have had permanent seats at the United Nations Security Council. And Africa has been demanding for a United Nations Security Council seat, a permanent seat at the United Nations Security Council since the 1960s, starting with Dr. Kwame Nkrumah, who mentioned this. And we have not been paid attention to. So in the past, if this has not been done, we see this. If Joe Biden, the president of the United States, comes out to support this, we see this as a victory. This is a victory to us as Africans. If we get a seat at the at the United Nations Security Council, a permanent seat at the United Security Council, the United Nations Security Council. So this becomes a victory. The other thing which was mentioned after the summit was that Africa would get a seat at the G20. At the G20, these countries which discuss the economic future of the world, Africa will be able to get a seat at the G20 so that we can also be at the table. We need to be at the table when the world is discussing the future of the world, the economic future of the world. So Africa needs to be there. Let us remember also that South Africa is already there. So if we already have South Africa there and we have Africa as a continent added, then that means we have 2 seats at the G20. Let us remember also that continents like Europe are there, but we also have Britain and Germany, even though these are all European countries. So they are still already at the G20. So Africa needs to be there, needs to be present at the G20. So that is achievement number 2. I believe that was a win. Number 2. The other thing was that the African Union also and South Africa together, which was a win, they were able to maintain their position. They were able to stand their ground. If you look at the presentation by the African Union, the 6 points which I spoke about, African Union was able to state its position that this is what we expect from this summit. And so South Africa also stood its ground, and its position has been consistent. When you look at the presentation of South Africa at the 77th United Nations General Assembly, they maintained that Africa wants to move and take an independent course. We don't want to be coerced by the United States into choosing our partners, across the globe, which I've already spoken about. So South Africa and the African Union were able to maintain that position. We're able to push that position, and we want to appreciate that definitely as Africans. There was also some investments. Win number 4, which came out of the African Union Summit, the US Africa Summit. There was investments. Some investments were secured. Countries like Uganda were able to get investment for their oil refinery, which is going to be built in the western part of the country, $4.5 billion. Ethiopia also was able to secure some loans for up to $600 million, and then we were able to secure also a corridor which is going to be built between Niger and Benin, $500 million, and Ghana, I think, was not able to achieve some investments, even though through this it was able to sign a loan through the IMF of around $3 billion, and so other things we are able to, we were able to achieve a few things definitely, which you expect from the United States, because the summit itself in some way came off as some sort of a feel-good conversation. If you look at from when it started up to when it ended, it came off as a feel-good conversation where the United States has again come, even though it was maintaining that it is talking about partnership with Africa so that it can listen to Africa, but it still maintained its position of trying to lecture to Africa what to do and where to go, and telling us the threats, what are the threats for our continent, as if we don't know our continent, as if we don't know the threats to our continent. If you listen to people like Lloyd Austin, the Secretary of Defense, he was telling us how Russia and China is a threat, how imperialism is a threat. So these things came off still as the United States still trying to preach to us as Africans, and we think that this is not very acceptable, but definitely we were able to make some wins out of the summit. What were the failures? Number one, I think one of the failures was that as Africans, we failed to stand together, even though the African Union presented our position, but we failed to stand together as Africans. Why? Because the African Union, while it was presenting our points and our requirements and our expectations out of this summit, other leaders on the continent were taking things into their hands and going off the rails, going off the position of the African Union. And I can point out, people like President Nanado, while the African Union was maintaining that we want to be neutral in this position, in this situation of the Ukraine-Russia issue, President Akufo-Addo came off and went to support the United States and went to support Ukraine. So this fragments the efforts which we are making as a unified people, because we are trying to be a unified people as Africans. So we failed to stand together. Number two, we failed to hold the United States accountable for the previous pledges or the previous promises of the US-Africa Summit, which was held by President Obama, because during that time, by the time the summit was held, our economy on the African continent, it was doing well, but when it comes to trade, it was not doing well with the United States. Okay, and the trade between the United States and Africa during that period was around $64 billion. But 2 years after the summit, which was held in the same place in Washington, 2 years after the summit, we see again that our trade had not actually changed, even though the United States had pledged up to $46 billion, because we remember that they pledged $35 billion by the United States government, and they pledged around $11 billion in private investments by the private sector. But after a period of 2 years, from the summit, our trade actually had not changed on the African continent. And when we come to the year 2022, and we look at our trade is still the same, $64 billion, the same trade which was there when the summit, the first summit happened. So we asked what has changed. So there was failure to hold the United States accountable for the for the previous promises. So this shows you that the previous pledges which were made, which is up to around $46 billion, they did not come through. These pledges did not come through. The United States did not keep its pledges. So what makes us sure that the United States is still going to meet its pledges which were made in 2022? So that we failed out there. We failed to hold the United States accountable to the pledges it made. We failed to stand together as Africans. Okay, and we failed in consistency. We failed to be consistent. Okay, the other failure is that we undermined, through our failure to stand together, we undermined the African Union, the position of the African Union. When people like President Akufo-Addo goes out there and goes off the rail to mention his own position, that is different from the African Union, and what the African heads of state, the other African heads of state have held, then this undermines the African Union as an institution. It undermines even the regional bodies, okay? Regional bodies like the ECOWAS, because when President Akufo-Addo said that he is inviting the United States to come and help him in any way, from his conversations with the United States Department of State, the Secretary of State, Senator Blinken, you could see that he was blatantly inviting the United States, into his territory. And remember, it is already there. It already has a military base at the major international airport, and so he's inviting them more so that they can add more military infrastructure. And this is all without consulting the ECOWAS, without consulting the African Union. So these things should have been discussed through the African Union, first. Also, the other failure which we got was that President Felix Tshisekedi himself also should have taken the matter of Rwanda, because he spoke about it again, and this was something which was trumpeted, highly at this summit. President Tshisekedi, we believe that he should have discussed this issue of Rwanda, M23, and all the more than 150 rebel groups in Eastern DR Congo, which you cannot actually blame all of them on Rwanda, because some of them have been there for the last 6 years. He should have discussed this issue in the African Union and the East African community, which he himself, President Tshisekedi, he himself joined the East African community to try to solve this problem, and he had taken the right steps. So we believe that by going to the United States and ganging up with the United States against Rwanda, a member of the African Union and a member of the East African community, that means he's trying to undermine the African Union and the East African community, which has already deployed into Rwanda. And these things, I think that we should take them very seriously, because they are very important. And what are the lessons that we learned through this? We learned the oldest lesson that it has been always, spoken and been said and has been taught, that when we stand together, we stand to gain. Like we stood together as Africans and in solving the issue in Ethiopia, and we won without the interference of the Europeans, without the interference of the United States. And when Museveni and others, they call France to come and interfere in how the East African community and African Union is trying to solve the problem in the Democratic Republic of Congo, this becomes unfortunate. This means we are undermining our own institutions. So we need to stick together and solve these problems together. And this message also goes out to President Akufo-Addo and all the other African leaders and President Tshisekedi and all of them across the continent, that this is the oldest lesson that we can learn, that has been preached through all ages, that we need to stand together. We need to stand together to be able to solve our problems as Africans. Number two, we need to be consistent. President Akufo-Addo and Ghana and Ivory Coast, when they come together to demand prices, fair prices for cocoa, we need to stay consistent on that. We don't need to be swayed by maybe some adversity that may be manipulated from outside. And then if we go off the rail and we stop demanding for fair prices for our cocoa. So we need to stand together as Africans. We need to be consistent. These are the lessons I believe that we learned from the US Africa Summit. It has been expectations, wins and losses, and then lessons from the US Africa Summit that was held in 2022, which was a very important and major event on the African political calendar. I want to thank you. My name is Kwame Gonza, and I'm out of there. I'm saying Africa must unite, Africa must unite, Africa must unite. See you next time. Thank you.